You're on the fifth floor. Let's go to the world of arts and literature now. Sherko Bekas is a Kurdish poet who died this year, aged 73. He was also a political activist, a member of the Kurdish liberation movement, and a critic of corruption. Here he is reading from his poem Butterfly Valley. It marks the killing of thousands of Kurds in Saddam Hussein's Iraq during 1988.
Don't bury those white flowers till I come. Wait. Don't give them up to the cradle of history. Let them lie on their backs on the grass hill. Let them rest on the water's forearm. Let them lean on the wind's shoulder. Don't close the sky of their eyes.
Sherko Bekas. So what makes his poetry groundbreaking? Kurdish poet Choman Hardi translated that poem, and she's been speaking with Kareem Abdulrahman from BBC Monitoring, who is also Kurdish.
He was very original in many ways. Once he told me that before he started writing, he usually read dictionaries. And this reflected very much in his writing because, as you know, in most of the book-length poems, before he started reading the poetry, he used to introduce the words, the new words, which he had in every book. And he brought these words, which were never used, were part of the dictionary, Kurdish dictionary, but not really part of the tradition of poetry. He introduced them to it. That's just on the linguistic level. But he also introduced poster poem in 1975, and he first started as a poet of resistance, but he actually remained on top of all the contemporary subjects that came his way, whether it was oppression of women, whether it was corruption in the Kurdistan regional government. So he carried on adapting and renewing himself.
Would you like to explain to us what's a poster poem?
They're short poems that they're like posters. They like postcards, in fact. Very short, and they're sort of image poems, which didn't exist. This concept didn't exist in Kurdish poetry altogether. And he brought it in. And of course, he was one of the first Kurdish poets who was very widely translated into various languages, and he won prizes for the translations and for his work.
What I also find very interesting in his poetry is I see sort of two stages in it. Until 1991, it was more about the Kurdish resistance movements and the icons of the Kurdish nationalist movement. And after that, he sort of turns the lens of his camera, if you like, inwards, and he focuses more on the smaller details, and he wanders off from the bigger picture and the more historic and nationalist themes.
Yes, indeed. I think before that, and this is true with many poets, and national liberation was the main concern of a lot of Kurdish poetry until 1991. But after that, Sherko Bekes returns to Kurdistan. For a while, he's Minister of Culture, and then in 1998, he establishes Sardam Publishing House, and he's working with a number of intellectuals in the city of Suleymaniye. And he obviously lives day to day with the growing injustices around him. He's very much in touch. This is one thing that I think is very important about Sherko Bekes' poetry. He's a poet who's very well connected into his community. He's very well in touch with the political and social developments, and he responds as a poet to all the events that happen around him. Oppression of women is one of them. The rise of radical Islam is another. And in the last years of his life, corruption was another thing. As you know, in 2011, he wanted to read his book-length poem, Now a Girl is My Homeland, in the Holy Roshanbiri, the Roshanbiri Hall. And in fact, the authorities did not let him read it. This poet, who's been poet of resistance and national poet, in fact, he wants to read his new poem because there are elements which address corruption. He wasn't allowed to read it. Fortunately, there is independent media now, and two of the satellite channels actually recorded his whole reading of the poem and distributed. So they couldn't prevent him from reading it, but they actually prevented him from reading in that main hall, which is the Hall of Culture in Suleymaniye city.
This point is very interesting about his involvement in politics, because actually some of his critics have accused him of being too close to the ruling elite and the establishment for his own good.
Well, in the early 70s and 80s, of course, he was very much connected with the PUK, one of the political parties, and he wrote many poems about the martyrs, so-called people who died as members of the underground movement or as Peshmerga, who were members of the PUK. And he had also a conflict with the KDP, the other ruling party, Kurdistan Democratic Party. And this actually came with him in his history until actually in the last 10 years, where he made peace with different political parties, and he started writing about victims from all sides of the political arena. But I think this accusation is probably, first of all, I don't think it's fair. Secondly, I think he actually went beyond that, beyond being a poet of a particular party or a movement or just the national liberation poet. He is a poet who responds, who writes about contemporary events, who's very much concerned about the young people, the women, the poor, and so on. So I don't think that's a fair judgment of him.
Yeah, I personally think Bekas might have flirted with politics. He was the first culture minister, as we know. He might have been friends with politicians, and he was the chairman of a publishing house. However, I think all of these pale into insignificance compared to the colossal literary heritage he left behind.
Indeed, and you know, he was actually, his life was in danger a number of times because of his writing. We know that a very short poem called Little Hammer the Shoeshiner talks about a little boy who's a shoeshiner, and he's talking to people. He's saying, put your foot down so I shine your shoes. Lawyer, judge, murderer, teacher. And at the end he says, no one is left but God. And how large would be God's shoes, and how much money would he pay for that? And this is just a little boy talking from a poor little boy talking perspective. And it led to a fatwa by the radical Islamists, and they said this was blasphemy and they wanted him to get killed. So he has paid for it, he has suffered for his writing, but he has remained true to what he believes. And sometime in his life, maybe he was politically connected to one party and limited to that, but I think he went beyond that as he went on.
Yeah, that point about his poetry, and sometime it might have upset some of the people who were more conservative, and especially the religious people, thinking people. I found interesting the story about and his wish to be buried in a public park. Do you like to comment on that?
Yeah, there were three main features of his will, basically. First of all, he said he didn't want to be buried in another famous hill, graveyard, because he doesn't like these to be in, overcrowded places. But he likes to be in Parki Azadi, the Freedom Park, which is a busy place full of living people and music and dance. So he wanted to be surrounded by the living, first of all. The second thing was he wanted his books and his whatever he owned to be brought there to where he's buried, and to have a little cafe where, he specifically says, where writers and lovers can come and read and enjoy. And then the third part of his will was to have a prize called Bekes Prize, which he's left money behind to support this prize. And these were three main things which caused a lot of discussion, as you know, because there's no tradition that poets or anyone can be buried in a public place like a park, a park which is a place for, fun. And now a poet wants to be buried amongst the people. And this caused a lot of concern. And in fact, they say that we have buried him there temporarily because there's supposed to be a graveyard for the famous people, so-called, and he's going to be transported there, but I don't think he wanted that. He wanted to stay in Azadi Park.
Remembering the poet Sherko Bekas, Choman Hardi was speaking with Kareem Abdulrahman of BBC Monitoring.